They offered her enough money to disappear forever. She handed it back and asked for a pen instead to sign a prenup. The envelope sat on the glass table for 4 minutes before anyone touched it. Han Mi-suk had slid it across herself, in a private lounge on the top floor of the Han Grand Manhattan, 2 hours before her son's engagement to another woman would be announced to 400 guests 1 floor below. She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. She told the young woman across from her, calm as a weather report, that $200,000 and a job in Dubai were more than generous for a housekeeper's daughter who'd mistaken proximity for belonging. Nadia Bankel looked at the envelope. Then she looked at the woman who'd raised her son, watched her son, and never once in 26 years gotten Nadia's mother's name right. She pushed the envelope back. Her hand didn't shake. Everything under her skin did. "Do you have a pen?" she said. "If you want to protect this family from a scandal, buying my silence isn't the fastest way. Let me sign whatever you need. Then let me walk into that ballroom on my own terms." Mi-suk did not expect that answer. 6 months later, everyone at the Han Grand Manhattan would tell this story differently. Some would say Han Yi-won burned his own inheritance for a woman his mother considered beneath the family name. Some would say he finally became worth the name at all. Both are right. Neither one was in the room when a housekeeper's daughter asked a billionaire's mother for a pen instead of a payoff. Hey, before we get into this, if you're folding laundry, driving home, or scrolling in the dark with the sound low, stay with me. Welcome, besties. This story starts in the servants' quarters of one of the most exclusive hotels in the world and ends somewhere none of the 400 guests in that ballroom saw coming. Get comfortable. By the time we're back at that envelope on the floor, you're going to need a second to breathe. The Han Hotel Group began small and desperate. Han Di-sung arrived in Seoul in 1958 with 1 rented room above a noodle shop and a wife who cleaned it herself because they couldn't afford help. He rented it to traveling merchants, then the room next to it. By the time he died at 81, that 1 mattress on a wooden floor had become 11 5-star hotels across Seoul, Busan, and Tokyo, plus a Manhattan flagship he insisted on naming, simply the Han Grand. Di-sung had a saying, "A hotel isn't a building. It's every person who makes a stranger feel like they belong somewhere for 1 night." He meant it about guests. He never quite applied it to the housekeepers and porters who did the actual belonging-making while his family slept 11 floors above them. His son, Han Sung-min, inherited the company at 34 and ran it cautiously for 26 years, protecting what his father built rather than growing it. He died of a stroke at 60, leaving the Han Group to his widow, Han Mi-suk, as interim chair, and his 29-year-old son, Yi-won, as heir apparent. A title that comes with scrutiny, not power. Mi-suk married into the family at 23, from a respectable but far less wealthy household, and spent 3 decades learning exactly which alliances mattered. She loved her son genuinely, but she'd also spent his entire adult life quietly engineering one outcome: a marriage to Choi Seo-yeon, daughter of a rival Korean hotel dynasty with deep capital and an aggressive footprint in the Southeast Asian markets the Han Group had never cracked. Structured right, the marriage was a merger. 2 fortunes, 2 boards with every reason to cooperate instead of compete. She'd spent 3 years engineering it with the same patience her father-in-law once used to acquire his second hotel room. She was 8 weeks from watching it pay off, at a gala timed to the hotel's 15th anniversary. She hadn't accounted for the fact that her son had fallen for someone else 11 years earlier, in a stairwell, when he was 18 and she was 17, and that it had never actually ended. Mi-suk knew exactly what was at stake because she'd watched it happen before. Her own mother-in-law had spent decades scrubbing the family's poverty out of its public story, curated portraits, curated press. Mi-suk absorbed the lesson without ever saying it out loud. Survival in this family meant managing the story, and any loose thread was a vulnerability. She'd also watched a rival Seoul dynasty lose 40% of its market value in 18 months after an inheritance dispute went public. She built the Choi alliance, in part, so the Han Group would never become that story. Fear, more than coldness, drove it, but fear like that hardens into control. Comfort Bankel came to New York from Lagos at 24, chasing honest work and a cousin's promise. The honest work was housekeeping at a Queens hotel, until a Han Group recruiter noticed her and hired her for the new Manhattan flagship. She was 26. That same year, she had her only daughter, Nadia. The father went back to Nigeria before Nadia could remember his face. Comfort raised her alone in a one-bedroom in the Bronx, 40 minutes by train from the beds she made for a living. Over a decade, Comfort rose to head of housekeeping, real respect, never quite real recognition. Nadia grew up split between two worlds, a tight money apartment in the Bronx and the marble lobby of the Han Grand Manhattan, where her mother tucked her into the staff break room with a coloring book and strict instructions not to wander. That's where she met Yiwon. She was 9. He was 10, bored, wandering down from the private school his father insisted on. He found a girl on an overturned bucket, coloring with a broken box of crayons. He asked what she was drawing. She told him it was none of his business unless he had better crayons. 20 minutes later, he came back with a fresh box smuggled from his own room. She let him stay. For 8 years, they built something neither family acknowledged, because acknowledging it meant admitting a hotel lobby and a staff break room had grown something real between them. They had a private language built out of the building itself. The 4th-floor stairwell was the office. The 12th-floor linen closet was the vault, where at 13 Nadia told him about her father leaving, the only time she ever told anyone, and where a year later he admitted he resented a company he hadn't even inherited yet. At 16, it became something else. A first kiss in that same stairwell. Weeks of awkwardness until Yiwon, 17 now, told her plainly he didn't want to pretend it hadn't happened. She didn't want to pretend either. That same year, Mi-suk nearly caught them. She paused outside the closet door during a surprise linen inspection, heard voices, decided it was staff chatter, and walked on. Neither of them ever fully talked about how close that was. Both of them got more careful. It ended the summer he turned 18, 3 days before London. He found her in the stairwell and told her, clumsily, that he didn't know how to be with her while his mother controlled every part of his life that mattered, so it would be easier to leave without promises. She told him she understood. She didn't tell him she cried the whole subway ride home. She didn't tell him she spent the next 4 years building a life with nothing to do with hotels or Manhattan, architecture school upstate, chosen specifically for the distance, a choice she never fully explained to anyone who asked. By 29, Nadia had a career she was proud of, senior design consultant at a boutique firm that restored aging luxury hotels without stripping their character. 6 years in, her firm made the shortlist for a renovation of the Han Grand Manhattan's East Wing, purely on merit. She didn't know the board member overseeing it was Yiwon. She found out when she walked into the conference room and he was already there. 11 years older than the last time she'd seen him, in a stairwell, telling her he had to go. Neither of them handled it gracefully. He nearly knocked over his coffee. She stood frozen in the doorway before recovering enough to shake his hand like a stranger, which, professionally, was exactly what this had to look like. The meeting itself went perfectly. She pitched a vision that honored the building's 1958 bones while modernizing it, original stonework preserved, period fixtures sourced from the same artisan families, lighting that respected the past without turning the lobby into a museum. She fielded a pointed budget question without blinking. By the end, it was obvious to everyone in the room. Her firm was the strongest candidate. Yiwon found her at the elevators afterward, not as a board member. He asked if she had time for coffee, because he owed her a better conversation than the one he'd left her with 11 years ago. She had 45 minutes. You'd better use them well. They talked for 2 hours. He canceled the meeting waiting for him upstairs. The coffee shop was small, unglamorous, 3 blocks away, deliberately chosen so no one from either world would look for them there. The first 20 minutes were careful small talk. Then Nadia broke through it. She told him she'd spent 2 years angry at him, not for leaving, but for how easy it looked. His goodbye had sounded like relief. He didn't flinch. He told her she wasn't wrong. At 18, some part of him had felt relief not at losing her, but at getting an excuse to stop choosing her over and over against his mother's plans. Leaving let him postpone the choice indefinitely. He told her he understood now, at 30, what a coward that made him. She told him about architecture school, chosen to get as far from his family's hotel as possible. About her mother, still head of housekeeping in the same building. He told her about the exhausting weight of being groomed for something no one ever asked if he wanted, about staged dinners with a merger candidate that made him feel almost nothing, compared to a girl with a broken box of crayons. Neither of them said anything that day about starting over. But when her firm won the contract 2 weeks later, both of them understood the project was going to need a lot more of his direct oversight than any comparable project ever had. Nadia spent those 2 weeks going back and forth with herself, calling her college roommate twice. Her roommate asked the question that settled it. Was she more afraid of the project going badly or going well? Nadia sat with that a long time before admitting the second one scared her more. The renovation ran 8 months. Yiwon found reasons, real ones, at first, to show up for more of it than his job required. Material meetings he could have delegated. Site walks twice a week that ran 20 minutes longer than any progress review needed. Nadia noticed. She told herself for 6 weeks that she just appreciated a thorough client. She stopped telling herself that in week 7, reviewing lighting for the restored 1958 lobby ceiling. He mentioned his grandfather picked the original fixtures himself, back when the whole building was 11 rooms. She told him her mother scrubbed those same chandeliers by hand for 6 years, before the hotel could afford a maintenance crew. The rickety ladder, the ache in her shoulders, the kindergarten homework Nadia did on the lobby floor 20 feet below while her mother worked above her. Yiwon went quiet. Not surprised. He'd always known comfort worked there, in the abstract. This was something heavier, a fuller understanding of how much of the building he'd taken for granted had literally been shaped by the hands of the woman who raised the girl he was falling for again. "I should have known that," he said. "You did know it," she said. "You just never had to think about it." He didn't argue. Later, she'd tell him that was the difference this time. At 18, he left when the distance got inconvenient. At 30, he sat inside the discomfort instead. 2 weeks later, he asked Comfort to lunch. Not Nadia, just her. He asked real questions about 22 years in his family's building, about what the job actually required that no guest ever saw. She told him near the end that she wasn't interested in being anyone's guilty conscience, that if he cared about the people who kept the hotel running, the caring had to go further than one lunch with her daughter's boyfriend's family conscience. He took it seriously. Quietly, without press, he pushed through tuition assistance for housekeeping and maintenance staff, doubled holiday bonuses, and overhauled a promotion pipeline that had kept people like Comfort capped for years. He met resistance, executives calling it indulgent. He held firm, commissioning a study that found housekeeping staff waited an average of 14 years for any supervisory role, versus 4 years for corporate hires. Numbers are harder to dismiss than feelings. None of it was purely about Nadia, but falling for her again is what made the gap impossible to keep ignoring. Their relationship grew in the unremarkable moments two people build when they're trying not to name what's happening, late dinners after site visits that ran past any reasonable hour. A Sunday Yiwon showed up at Comfort's apartment with groceries and got taught, badly, how to make jollof rice. An afternoon Comfort later called interesting, in a tone that said she already understood everything. It crystallized the night the East Wing reopened, 8 months after that first awkward reunion. The party had wound down. Nadia stood alone in the restored lobby, running her hand along the stonework, finally letting herself just feel something about the work instead of calculating it. "You did something remarkable here," he said, coming to stand beside her. "We did something remarkable," she corrected. "This building is your family's history. I just stopped it from hiding." "I don't want to hide anymore either," he said. It wasn't entirely clear he meant the lobby. She didn't answer with words. She took his hand, in the marble lobby her mother had scrubbed by hand 2 decades earlier, and neither of them let go for a long time. The relationship stayed private for months. Not shame, Yiwon insisted, just a plan to build something solid before facing his mother. They met mostly at Nadia's Brooklyn apartment. He kept the Seoyeon courtship technically alive on paper, mostly to buy time. It wasn't comfortable. Nadia found herself resenting the secrecy even while she understood it, timing visits around his driver's schedule, deflecting coworkers, and underneath all of it, a quiet fear she never said out loud. That history might repeat. That he might decide, again, it was easier to let her go than fight for her. It unraveled after 5 months, through nothing more dramatic than ordinary carelessness. Yi-won's driver saw him leaving Nadia's building at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday and mentioned it to Mi-suk's assistant, not gossip, in his mind, just information for a family he was loyal to. Mi-suk didn't confront her son directly. She commissioned a background check on Nadia instead, using a firm the company used for due diligence. The report came back clean, no debt beyond student loans, no criminal history, a stable, self-built financial life. What alarmed Mi-suk wasn't in the file. It was one line, Nadia's mother's occupation and 22 years at the Han Grand Manhattan. That single line rewrote the whole story in Mi-suk's head. From accomplished young professional to housekeeper's daughter who worked her way into my son's life. She confronted Yi-won that night. Calm as always, she asked if he understood what he was risking, not just the Choi alliance, but how the board, investors, and the industry would see a chairman's son who couldn't tell partnership from proximity. He told her he understood exactly what he was risking, and that 8 months had taught him it wasn't a risk at all next to what he'd lose walking away from Nadia twice. Mi-suk didn't argue. She told him she hoped he understood what she'd do to protect the family, and left before he could ask what that meant. He'd find out in 11 days. Mi-suk didn't go to Nadia directly. She sent Director Yoon, a decades-long family fixer who'd quietly handled every uncomfortable problem the Hans preferred not to touch themselves, including 2 of Yi-won's father's own relationships in years past. Yoon reached Nadia through her firm, framing it as a second project, the Busan flagship. Nadia walked in expecting business. She found Mi-suk instead, one sealed envelope on the table. She understood the meeting in seconds. Mi-suk didn't waste time on pleasantries. Young people, she said, mistake nostalgia and proximity for something deeper, especially when one of them grew up with more access to the other's world. She laid out carefully why the relationship couldn't survive contact with reality. The press scrutiny, the board's resentment, a lifetime of being underestimated for marrying up. She framed all of it as kindness. $200,000 and a senior design job in Dubai, generous terms, she said, for real talent who deserved a career on its own merits. Nadia sat with it. Something cold and precise settled over her, not quite anger. She noticed Mi-suk's hands on the table weren't as steady as her voice. "You think I'm after his money," Nadia said. "I think you may not fully understand what you're after. My mother has scrubbed floors in this building for 22 years, Nadia said, steady. I know exactly what this family's wealth costs the people who keep it running. I'm not confused about anything, Mrs. Han. I know precisely what I'm choosing, and precisely what I'd give up letting you buy me out of it. Then understand this is a business proposal, not an insult, Mi-suk said. Take it. Build the career you've earned, somewhere you don't spend your life being measured against a fortune you'll never be part of. Nadia pushed the envelope back. Do you have a pen? If you're worried about scandal, buying my silence isn't the fastest way to protect this family's name. Signing whatever paperwork you need, and letting me walk into whatever room I choose on my own terms, that is. Mi-suk didn't have a pen. The meeting ended without the clean resolution she'd planned, and with Nadia walking out having said no to $200,000 in a way that unsettled Mi-suk far more than tears or an argument would have. Nadia didn't tell Yi-won for 4 days, not to deceive him, but because she didn't know how to talk about it without either shrinking it or turning it into a fight he wasn't ready for. She told her mother first, over Sunday jollof rice, gripping the same worn kitchen table Ed she'd done her homework on as a kid. You said no, Comfort said, not a question. I said no. Comfort was quiet a long moment. I have cleaned that woman's bathroom for 22 years, she said. She has never once said my name correctly, not once. She set down her fork, deliberate. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you so you understand who you're dealing with. She has never had to understand this. That's a kind of power all its own and dangerous to underestimate. I'm not underestimating her. I turned down the money. That was the easy part, Comfort said. The harder part is what she does next, now that money didn't work. Women like her do not accept no, they regroup. She took her daughter's hand, rare for her. I've watched that family for 22 years. I've watched Mi-suk lose exactly 2 fights in all that time. She does not lose gracefully, be ready. She was right. Nadia told Yiwon on the 5th day. He listened in a silence that got more rigid with every word, his jaw setting in a way she'd never seen, not even during the hardest weeks of the renovation. She offered you money to disappear. She offered me a severance package from a relationship she doesn't think I deserve to be in, Nadia said. I said no. I meant it. I'm not telling you to ask you to fix anything. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what your mother's willing to do, and because I won't let this become a secret between us. He was quiet a long time. I need to end things with Seo-yeon, formally, publicly, before my mother tries anything else. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. There isn't one. There's just the moment I stop being a coward. That's not a decision to make angry. I'm not making it angry. I'm making it because 5 months of keeping this quiet let my mother believe she had more time than she should have had. That's on me. He didn't fix it immediately. Ending a courtship his mother had spent 3 years engineering wasn't a single honest conversation. It was weeks of every attempt to see Seo-yeon alone, getting quietly redirected by his mother's office. Scheduling conflicts too convenient to be coincidence. Mi-suk inserting herself into meetings that should have been private, always with a reasonable business excuse attached. He recognized the pattern within 2 weeks and found himself exactly where he'd promised Nadia he wouldn't be again. Caught between the life his mother built around him and the honesty he owed the woman he loved, watching time slip, while his mother's careful management kept denying him the moment. What neither of them knew, Mi-suk's failed payoff hadn't gone unnoticed inside the family. Yiwon's cousin, Han Tae-yong, deputy chairman, and for a decade the board's quiet, stable alternative to Yiwon, had heard about it through the same research firm, whose lead investigator considered it idle professional gossip rather than a betrayal. Tae-yong saw what Mi-suk, fixated on the Choi alliance, hadn't. A scandal timed correctly could do more than kill one merger. It could raise enough doubt about Yiwon's judgment that a transition period, with Tae-yong as interim chief executive, started to look responsible instead of opportunistic. He worked 4 board members individually, never together, never comparing notes. To Director Kwon, worried about competitive pressure, he framed it as operational risk, a distracted COO in a cutthroat market. To Director Park, close to Mi-suk and invested in the Choi alliance, he framed it as personal betrayal, weaponizing her loyalty to the mother against the son. To Director Lim, an old guard board member since Dae-sung's era, he reached for legacy, suggesting the founder himself would be troubled watching his grandson's judgment collapse over sentiment. It required no fabrication, just a convenient reading of a dead man nobody could contradict. He told no one about the plan, not even Mi-suk, who he knew would object to anything risking her son's position rather than just redirecting his romantic choices. His resentment ran deeper than this one scandal. As the son of Dae-sung's daughter, he'd never been in line to inherit at all, a fact that shaped his entire adult life. From the MBA, he got to make himself indispensable, to a decade of quietly outperforming Yiwon while his cousin collected the title anyway. He'd told himself it was professional concern. It came out later, in the board's investigation, that he'd once told a colleague, drunk, late, at a company function, that he sometimes wondered what his life would look like if his mother had been born a son. Harmless venting at the time, not so harmless in hindsight. Over 3 weeks, board members who'd never questioned Yiwon's leadership started quietly raising doubts, one calling it, at a dinner Tae-yong had personally engineered, the appearance of favoritism in how the renovation contract was awarded. There was no substance to it. Nadia's firm won on merit, weeks before the relationship even started. It didn't need substance. It just needed to exist in enough rooms until it started to feel true. Mi-suk had no idea her own nephew was quietly building a case against her son, using the exact situation she'd tried and failed to bury. She kept pursuing her own angle, pressuring the hotel's general manager to start scrutinizing Comfort's work, hopping to manufacture a reason to end her employment and pressure Nadia through a channel far more painful than a rejected envelope. The pressure on Comfort started small. A performance review after 22 years without one. A 3-year-old linen discrepancy resurfacing from the archives. A sudden requirement to file written reports on tasks she'd handled verbally for decades. A pointed comment in front of junior staff about whether her training methods still matched current industry best practices. Nothing technically wrong with it, and unmistakable anyway. Comfort knew manufactured pressure when she saw it. She also knew fighting it head-on, as a housekeeper against a general manager acting for the family that owned the building, wasn't a fight she'd win. She told Nadia only after the review was already scheduled. Nadia could hear real fear under her mother's calm this time. "They can't fire you over nothing," Nadia said, and heard, even as she said it, how naive it sounded. "They will not fire me over nothing," Comfort said. "They will fire me over something manufactured to look like a real reason. No court will ever prove otherwise." Nadia told Yiwon that night. Something in him hardened, quiet, immovable. He confronted his mother the next morning and, for the first time in the entire crisis, raised his voice. Mi-suk didn't lie. She'd suggested the review herself, calling it oversight rather than retaliation, though the timing said otherwise, and even she sounded less certain than usual saying it. "You're trying to hurt her mother to get to her," he said, "after the money didn't work. I am trying to protect this family. You're going to lose me protecting a version of this family that doesn't need protecting from anything except your own fear." He left before she could answer, something that had never happened between them before. She sat alone in her study a long time afterward, replaying the envelope meeting, replaying her own arrival into this family at 23, and for the first time asked herself whether she'd spent months protecting Nadia from a loneliness or recreating it. Yiwon shut the review down the next day, using his own authority to close it and issue Comfort a written apology, well within his rights. Tae-young, watching from the board, saw it as exactly the ammunition he needed. Unilateral executive action, protecting a personal relationship over institutional integrity. By the end of that week, his narrative was close enough to critical mass that he decided it was time to stop suggesting and start moving. That same week, Nadia hit her limit, her mother's job under threat, board rumors reaching her second hand. Underneath all of it, the exhausting sensation of being reduced, in rooms she wasn't even in, to a category, the complication. She called her college roommate and cried for the first time since this started, admitting some small part of her wondered if leaving would be easier. Her roommate listened for 20 minutes, then asked if she actually wanted to leave or if she was just tired of being tested. Nadia sat with that, then admitted she wasn't tired of Yiwon. She was tired of a system built to make people like her feel replaceable. Leaving would only prove it right. She didn't leave. Tae-young's opening came early. The Han Grand Manhattan's 15th anniversary gala, a year in planning, timed by Mi-suk to double as the public announcement of Yiwon and Seo-yeon's engagement in front of 400 guests, board members, investors, and press. By that week, Yiwon still hadn't formally ended things with Seo-yeon. Every attempt at a real conversation quietly redirected by his mother's office. Still hopping momentum alone would force the outcome she wanted. Tae-young saw his window. 3 days before the gala, he arranged a story with a business publication, drafted, not published, ready to run the moment the gala ended, questioning whether Yiwon's entanglement had improperly influenced a multi-million-dollar contract. Time to land right after an engagement announcement, so the story would look as bad as possible. He also tipped off Seo-yeon's family. Not loyalty to the alliance, he understood a public, humiliated Choi withdrawal would create exactly the kind of chaos that made his stability pitch easier. Choi Hyun-woo, Seo-yeon's father, spent an evening on the phone weighing a public, maximally embarrassing withdrawal. It was Seo-yeon who talked him down, arguing that turning her own humiliation into spectacle would only benefit whoever leaked it, and she had no interest in being a pawn twice in 1 week. She'd suspected for weeks that Yi-won's attention had drifted. She requested a private meeting 2 days before the gala and told him plainly. She had no interest in marrying a man in love with someone else, and she was withdrawing quietly, on her own terms. I'd rather be known as the woman who walked away with dignity than the one humiliated at her own engagement, she told him. Do whatever you're going to do at that gala. Just don't drag me into it. He thanked her, genuinely grateful, and walked out with zero remaining obligation to a match he'd never wanted. The gala opened exactly as planned. 400 guests filled the restored ballroom, the same 1958 space Nadia's firm had spent 8 months bringing back to life, stonework and chandeliers gleaming under gold light. Mi-suk, still unaware Seo-yeon had already withdrawn 2 days earlier, spent the first hour working the room like a woman about to close 3 years of careful strategy. She had no idea the ground under her had already shifted. Yi-won pulled her into the same private lounge where, weeks earlier, she'd slid an envelope across a table. He told her plainly, no engagement tonight. He was making an announcement of his own, one she wasn't going to like, and one he wasn't delaying any longer. For the first time in the whole crisis, something in Mi-suk broke, not into anger, into fear. She sat down heavily. Everything I've done, she said, voice unsteady, I did because I was afraid of losing what your grandfather built. I let that fear make me cruel to a woman who only ever loved you honestly, and I don't know how to undo it. You don't undo it by hiding from it, he said. You undo it by watching what I do next, and deciding to actually be on my side instead of managing me from a distance. He walked back into the ballroom and took the microphone before the program called for it. The room quieted, expecting an engagement announcement. Cameras raised. A string quartet fell silent, sensing something before anyone said a word. What 400 guests heard instead? Han Yi-won, standing in a ballroom his great-grandfather's first rented room had grown into, saying calmly, without shame, that there would be no engagement tonight, because his heart had belonged, since he was 18, to a woman near the back of the room. 11 years and one necessary set of mistakes to stop being a coward about it. A murmur rose. Board members exchanged alarmed glances, bracing for exactly the kind of spectacle the family had spent generations avoiding. He asked Nadia Bankel to come stand beside him. Everyone who got chills, comment ballroom right now, because I need company. This is the moment the whole story's been building to, and it's about to get more complicated before it gets to the ending you want, because Taeyong isn't done, and that drafted story is still sitting ready to run. Don't skip ahead. Nadia had come by invitation, positioned near the back, close enough to witness, far enough to stay invisible. That plan lasted exactly as long as it took Yi-won to stop waiting. She'd spent the evening watching from the margins, half expecting to be quietly asked to move somewhere less visible. She wore a deep emerald dress, the first genuinely expensive thing she'd ever bought herself, and had spent 20 minutes that afternoon telling her mirror she had every right to be there. She was still repeating it when her name left his mouth across the room. Every head turned. Her first instinct, absurd, was to check if anyone needed a refill, a reflex built from years of watching her mother move invisibly through rooms exactly like this one. Then she remembered. Tonight she wasn't staff. Tonight the room had gone silent because of her. Near the front, Comfort stood rigid in her housekeeping uniform, hand over her mouth, tears already streaming. Nadia walked to the front. Every step felt longer than the distance. 11 years of a stairwell goodbye, 5 months of secrecy, 1 rejected envelope, a lifetime of watching her mother clean floors in a building that had never once felt like it belonged to people like them. She kept her eyes on Yi-won and refused to catalog the 400 faces, deciding, in real time, what kind of woman she must be. When she reached him, he didn't just take her hand for a photo. He told the room what his mother had spent weeks trying to bury. That Nadia's mother had worked in this building for 22 years, that Nadia had grown up inside its walls, that his family had offered her money to disappear, and she'd refused it, not because she needed convincing, but because she never once needed permission to know her own worth. That's when a board member near the front, one of Taeyong's, stood and suggested, loud enough to carry, that tonight's display raised real questions about Yiwon's fitness to lead. Rehearsed, obviously. Eyes turned toward Taeyong, standing at the side with a look of practiced concern that didn't quite hide the satisfaction underneath. What Taeyong hadn't accounted for. Mi-suk had already, in that private lounge 10 minutes earlier, finished reevaluating whose side she was on. She crossed the floor before the board member finished his sentence and took the microphone from her son, a move that made Yiwon brace for the rebuke he'd expected for weeks. Instead, she turned to the room. She confirmed, publicly, that she herself had offered Nadia $200,000 to leave her son's life, and that Nadia had refused it outright, asking instead for a pen to sign whatever the family needed, rather than take $1 to walk away from something she believed in. I have spent this entire crisis afraid of what my son's choice might cost this family, Mi-suk said. I'm only now understanding that the real risk was never his choice of partner. It was my own willingness to buy a good person's silence instead of simply asking her to earn my trust, which she has now done, far more thoroughly than money ever could. Then she turned to Taeyong. She told the room she'd recently learned that a board member had spent weeks quietly cultivating exactly this scandal, for reasons that had less to do with governance than a long-standing personal ambition for a role the board had never offered him. She would be requesting a formal investigation into an unpublished news story sitting ready to run, at a publication with prior financial ties to Taeyong's own ventures. The room turned on him completely. He tried to argue Mi-suk's accusation was reactive, unfounded. It didn't matter. In a room full of investors and press, already reeling from the night's revelations, the damage was immediate. Within the week, a board investigation, chaired personally by Mi-suk, in what board members later called her most decisive leadership in years, confirmed the connection. A paper trail of invoices tying Taeyong's personal accounts to payments made to the reporter on the story. A clear conflict of interest under the company's own bylaws, whether the story had ever run or not. The forensic accountant leading the review, a meticulous investigator named Ms. Cho, later called it one of the more clumsily executed schemes she'd seen, not from lack of intelligence, but because Taeyong underestimated how thoroughly a motivated adversary with real authority could reconstruct a paper trail. 2 board members came forward voluntarily, describing the carefully worded dinners where Taeyong planted doubt. Taeyong resigned before a formal vote could remove him, citing other opportunities. No one believed it. He relocated to a mid-tier consulting role in Singapore, and the family quietly stopped including him in anything. Years later, Yiwon would say the saddest part wasn't losing a cousin to ambition. It was realizing Taeyong might have earned real leadership eventually, on talent alone, if resentment hadn't convinced him a shortcut was worth it. Near the back service entrance, Comfort had been standing since her daughter's name left Yiwon's mouth, still in uniform, radio in hand, tears she'd stopped trying to hide. Mi-suk found her there 20 minutes later, after the board had begun quietly ushering Taeyong out. She crossed the room and stood beside her, unthinkable, hours earlier. 22 years, Mi-suk said. I have walked past you in this building for 22 years, and I don't believe I've ever once asked you a single question about your own life. You have not, Comfort said. Mi-suk was quiet, watching the last guests filter toward the coat check. I told myself treating staff with warmth would undermine this hotel's professionalism, she said. That was easier than admitting I never learned how to see people I'd decided belonged to a different category than my own family. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for considerably more than that. I'd like to start there if you'll let me. Comfort weighed 22 years of necessary distance against the raw moment in front of her. She thought of every holiday spent scrubbing floors while the family celebrated 11 stories up. Of every guest who called her simply housekeeping, like the word was a whole name. And she thought of her daughter, 20 minutes ago, refusing to disappear. My name is Comfort, she said. Comfort Bankel. I came here from Lagos the same year this hotel opened. I built a whole life in the small rooms behind it that your guests never see. I'd like you to remember my name correctly from now on. That's a good place for both of us to start. Misuk told her she would. She did. The aftermath was chaotic, and then, unexpectedly, good. The real story spread through the industry within days, most of it sympathetic, framed less as scandal and more as an unusually honest reckoning inside an image-obsessed industry. The Han Group's stock, which board members feared would drop, held steady. Analysts noting the public accountability actually strengthened investor confidence rather than shaking it. The Choi alliance dissolved within the week, amicably, and was replaced 18 months later by a straightforward joint venture on a Jeju resort, pure business terms, no marriage attached. Si-Hoyeon, dating someone entirely outside either family's orbit, later joked to Nadia at an industry conference that it was a much better way to merge two hotel chains than what your husband's mother originally had in mind. They ended up at the same table, unplanned, and found it less awkward than expected. Si-Hoyeon told Nadia, warmly, that she'd followed the gala story with quiet satisfaction, having grown up under her own family's engineered expectations, and that watching someone refuse to be managed had been genuinely inspiring at a moment she was working up her own nerve. They exchanged numbers and kept a friendly correspondence for years. Two women once positioned as rivals, finding more common ground than either family expected. Comfort Bankel was promoted, within 2 months of the gala, to Director of Hospitality.